Many of you will have already taken ENC 1102, and you certainly had high school English classes that were based on literature. So this will be a bit of a review, but it's always important to think about why we are here. Take a quick look at our agenda. Generally, we divide literature into these main types or genres. Within each, of course, there are subtypes as you see here. Because we typically read in English, we look to both British and American history to see how literature has evolved and changed over the years. However, one of the goals of this class is to look beyond tradition and see the broad variety of voices in literature. Spanish-speaking writers, for example, have made huge contributions to what is considered important literature. Language is key in literary studies, so even when we read non-English texts, there is always a concern that reading a translation is never quite the same. This is why most English classes focus on works written in English. Even so, there are some exceptions. For example, many of you have probably read some Chaucer updated in modern English, even though it's written in Middle English. Dante's Inferno is another work that most of us encounter translated from Italian to English. For me, one of the most interesting things about literature is that it can really be boiled down to two categories, romantic versus realistic. I'm always reminded of my mom's declaration in which she said, "There's only two kinds of movies, war pictures and sex pictures." Romanticism, though, is oversimplified if we just think of sex and love, just as it's too simple to think that realism always depicts war and hate. These are the general characteristics of literature that falls into the romantic category. Probably the biggest difference between romantic and realistic literature is that fantasy lives in romance. No sparkling vampires or ghosts in a realistic work of literature, I'm afraid. The lack of supernatural is key. You may have noticed that both the British and American timelines really stop in the early to mid 20th century. We're nearing another century since then, so in our modern culture, is the impulse more romantic or realistic? We won't really know what literature lasts and is considered important down the road, but we have both going on now. Twilight, Harry Potter, The Avengers, Game of Thrones, all romantic. Some mysteries are romantic while others are grounded in realism. All of the interest in how things work, how forensics solves crime, etc., would fall under the realism umbrella. It is fun, though, to consider what you like best as an individual. I have to say, I'm all over the place, but perhaps you recognize that you lean more towards romanticism or realism. Food for thought. The vast majority of you will not go on to major in English, write dissertations on literature, and live out the rest of your days reading literary criticism. However, when you're reading and researching literature for academic purposes, it's important to know some of the theoretical lenses that academics apply to literature. You'll read more about these in the textbook in the section entitled Critical Approaches, but I want to give you a little preview of what this means. Take a moment to read the definition and, of course, enjoy the cute dog. Our use of critical theory in Lit 2000 is twofold. First, as we read, we can notice things that pop out that would fit one of the critical lenses that academics use. For example, if I'm reading Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, I might be appalled that Hermia's father would rather have her put to death than allow her to marry a man of her own choosing. This would definitely strike a feminist critic's fancy, so I could apply that lens myself. In reading a chilling story like Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart, I might want to figure out what on earth made the narrator want to kill the old man. Perhaps I could dig into psychological criticism for some answers. The second use we have for critical theory comes as we research works of literature. The academics who have written the articles we are finding are likely using one or more of these critical lenses. Therefore, as researchers, it's important that we recognize what lens they're using. Just like when we watch or read the news, it's important to understand whether the outlet you're getting it from leans right or left. The fact that Fox is conservative or MSNBC is liberal isn't a problem if you know what you're getting. No matter what critical lens you want to apply to a work of literature, you'll need to prove your points by using the text. For me, then, the start of any good analysis of a literary work starts with a close reading and attention to the formal elements of whatever genre the work is. Take a look at the list of the formal elements of fiction and drama. Take a look at the list of the formal elements of poetry. In order to analyze literature, you can't just passively read it and let it wash over you. Sometimes people complain and wonder, why can't we just enjoy it? Well, we can, but the enjoyment is deeper and you're able to offer commentary and analysis if you really read something. This applies not only to literature, of course. You may have noticed that almost every syllabus for college courses contains at least some mention of critical thinking. It is one of the major goals of education, but what does it mean? This list gives you a pretty good idea of what it means to be a critical thinker and reader. What steps can you take to be an active reader? Take a moment to look at these strategies. Finally, let's look at some of the basics that will help you be strong in reading and responding to literature. Anytime you are writing about literature, keep these things in mind. First, in the humanities, we use traditional title capitalization, which means that all important words in a title are capitalized. You'll often see titles not done this way these days, and there are places where the rules are different, like psychology, sociology, and history. But in English, we use the old-fashioned way of marking titles. Second, and the rules on this are different in other disciplines as well, we use either quotation marks or italics according to what the source is. Books, films, plays, television shows, websites, databases. Large things get italics. So the course textbook's title, The Norton Introduction to Literature, would always appear in italics, as would Hamlet, the Avengers Infinity Wars, and even Wikipedia. Unfortunately, most websites do not use italics at all, so we're used to seeing titles done incorrectly. Quotation marks show that the title is part of something larger, a chapter, a poem, a song, a short story, an article from a magazine, an episode of a particular television show, or a specific web page. These titles would be marked with quotation marks. If you look at the table of contents in our textbook, the titles of the individual works are given in italics, which unfortunately is incorrect. However, if you look at any of the sample research papers in the book, see pages 760 to 64, for example, you'll notice that the Works Cited page does list the short story title, A Rose for Emily, and other articles and short works in quotation marks. Finally, it is important to know what you're reading. This can be very difficult these days because we access so much through a web browser. There is a difference, however, between a website, an ebook, and an article in a newspaper or magazine. Part of information literacy is knowing the difference between finding something on someone's blog on the web and an article published in a peer-reviewed journal. No doubt you learned about this in ENC 1101, but anytime you need a refresher, the LSSC Library's tutorial on information literacy is awesome. From the library's homepage, click on the Research Help button and then Tutorials for a complete list. Three phrases to live by when you're studying and writing about literature. Always provide direct textual evidence. Never just talk about what happens in the work of literature. Be scholarly in your approach to research paper writing. This applies to non-literature classes as well. If you keep these in mind, you'll never go wrong.